You could see feces on the floor, people sleeping two to a bed, head to foot, children next to adults, people suffering with tuberculosis, living on the same wards as people who were not tuberculosis patients. And doctors knew that that was, by the way, not the right thing to do because they had created quarantined wards at all the white hospitals. They just didn't care to do that at Crownsville. We know they knew better.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzullo. Our guest today is Antonia Hylton to talk about her important new best-selling book, Madness, in which she tells the 93-year history of Crownsville Hospital, established in 1911 as the Maryland Hospital for the Negro Insane. For decades, Crownsville housed the criminally insane, the mentally ill, adults and children, along with drunks and people suffering from syphilis and tuberculosis, all on one campus, which was understaffed and overcrowded. Patients were more likely to die in the facility than to be treated and discharged. Antonia Hylton is a Peabody and two-time Emmy award-winning correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, and also the co-host of the hit podcast South Lake and Grapevine. In Madness, she skillfully blends the intimate tales of patients and employees whose lives were shaped by Crownsville with a decade of investigative research and archival documents to create a heartbreaking meditation on how America decides who is sick or criminal and who is worthy of our care. It's also a personal story of how her own family dealt with the issue of mental health. It's my great honor to welcome Antonia Hylton as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzullo.
Good morning, Antonia, and thank you so much for doing this, and really admire your book. I recommend it to everybody. Very powerful.
Yeah, it's a long process. And I tell people there's kind of two origin stories usually. So there is the kind of classic origin story, which is I am a freshman in college at Harvard. I am kind of stumbling around trying to figure out what I want to be and what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And I stumble into this class about the history of psychiatry, and I become obsessed and discover Crownsville as part of that process and really just never let it go.
Yeah.
But I actually have come to think that there's an earlier point in my timeline that I think set me up for that moment, which is I was 11 years old, and some of my cousins had just come over to visit, hang out with me, and I'm one of 7 kids, so this is like packed house and a whole lot going on, and they finally leave, and I see my dad in the corner trying to get, just a quiet moment in to read by himself, and I went over to ask him about his cousins.
Yeah.
Because I realized I had never met any of my dad's cousins. And he tells me, well, actually you have, most of them you think are uncles. And then there's one cousin who I was very close to who's dead. And I should have asked, well, what happened? What's the story there?
Yeah.
And he tells me about his cousin Maynard, who was killed in the middle of a mental health episode in the 1970s by a police officer in Alabama in public on the steps of a federal building. And I was 11, I was very little. And so I didn't really know how to respond. But as I got older and I heard more about Maynard, more of the whispers, the rumors in the family, and I observed my father as an adolescent and then as an adult, I could see just how much the story of what happened to Maynard, his killing, had traumatized my dad, my grandparents, had changed my family, and had led to some practices. My family really struggled to talk about anything that had to do with emotions, mental health, anxiety, depression. There was evidence of a lot of it, but people just didn't want to address it.
Yeah.
And I came to realize that Maynard was kind of this, I think a lot of families, or even in people's personal stories, there's a moment where everything is different after that one moment. And Maynard is kind of this dividing line for a lot of people. And so I think that discovery and the uneasiness I felt from it kind of set me on a path where by the time I was out on my own and able to study and discover and do what I wanted to do, that mental health was really a priority of mine. I wanted to know everything I could know about it.
Yeah.
And so I've decided that I think that's the actual origin story, that moment, that conversation.
Well, that makes sense. Sure. So let's talk about Crownsville, because I don't think most people have ever heard of this hospital, but it certainly is kind of a horror story. And also an interesting reflection of the changes in attitudes about race in our country.
Well, Crownsville is a segregated mental institution that was founded in Maryland in 1911.
Mm-hmm.
But its founding comes after years of debate. So Maryland politicians, doctors, leaders, and actually really professionals all across the country had in the decades after emancipation been debating what they saw as a rise in insanity among the Negro race.
Mm-hmm.
And they would write openly papers, medical journals, debating their different theories about, well, why are Black Americans struggling so much? Why do they seem to have such a hard time finding, jobs, building families? And you would think that they might understand that coming out of enslavement.
That would have been kind of obvious.
Yeah, you would think the answer was obvious.
Right.
But instead, what you see is a lot of them say, well, they must kind of miss the good old days. Perhaps
Wow.
They needed the structure of enslavement. They needed that guidance from a master. And without that, they seem to be losing their way.
Yeah.
And so they decide that Black people's mental health is fundamentally different from white people's.
Huh.
That's really the first decision that's made.
Yeah.
And then second, that they don't want to provide their treatment or do this work in the same space in which they provide it to white people.
Mm-hmm.
So they come up with this system of segregated institutions all across the South. Crownsville isn't even the first. And so it's not. No, there were these same spots in Virginia, a very famous one opened in the 1800s called Central State, one in Georgia. There were segregated wards of institutions up in the north as well. And so Crownsville is coming out of a debate that's been raging for a while. It doesn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
But what makes Crownsville so interesting, what really drew me to it, is that the leaders there are writing openly about all this, and they decide they want to create a segregated institution. But boy, they don't want to pay for it.
Yeah. They don't even want to build it. Yeah.
They don't want to build it. So they do something unusual.
Yeah.
They come up with this idea, this scheme, kind of, to make the patients build the hospital for themselves. And they start with just 12 men who they march into a forest on March 13th of 1911. And they don't have a hospital ward, a place to relax, a place to get therapy or treatment. They start the backbreaking work of clearing a forest, moving railways, constructing a foundation, and building what becomes this massive 1,500-acre sprawling hospital campus with these huge brick structures that stand to this day in Maryland. If you're ever in the DMV area, you can go driving on Crownsville Road in Maryland near Annapolis and see these buildings for yourself. And, what immediately struck me when I first learned about all this about 10, 11 years ago was that, these people were deemed to be so sick, they couldn't be welcome in their community anymore. They had to be institutionalized, but they're so well, so healthy that they can do 12 to 16-hour shifts and construct buildings that have good enough bones
right.
that they're still around, 100 plus years later.
Right.
And that's where this story really begins. And that origin story and everything that it says about what we believe about Black people,
mm-hmm.
how we tie their health to their capacity to labor, it really sets in motion or it sets a very specific foundation for what this institution and other institutions like it become, start to represent to the communities that they're supposed to serve.
Yeah.
And I really argue by showing you the different eras of this institution throughout the book, all the way until it closed in 2004, within our lifetimes, that moment is still very relevant to us today because it sets the hospital up for a very particular set of failures and struggles that it goes throughout the entire 20th century.
Yeah.
I'm arguing in this book that in order for us to really understand why our current mental health system works the way that it does, we need to reckon with this. We need to better understand the decisions made at that time, because that's the only way we're going to build something better, not just for Black patients, but certainly for communities of color, but I think actually for everyone.
From the beginning, the idea of treatment was way back in terms of relevance. There was no effort to better understand what was afflicting these people. How are you going to make any progress in helping them? And that seems not to have been the focus of this institution from the beginning.
I would agree. You see this reflected. It's not really something that we have to theorize about or wonder, or maybe we worry that we're applying our kind of current conceptualization to a historical moment. You can actually see a lot of this in the records, that have been preserved in the Maryland State Archives, and which I kind of take the reader through in the book. Mm-hmm. You see them produce these monthly reports about what's happening at the institution, and what you can see month after month, year after year, is that the people running this institution, who for the first several decades were all white because they barred people of color from working there, was that they were really interested in how much the patients were producing.
Yeah.
What could they make? What could they sell? How much work did they get done on the farm?
Yeah.
How much money did we save? And they're not very interested in discharging patients. So there's not a whole lot about how someone recovered.
Right.
What a miracle. We got them back to their family. You would think you might find stories like this, and that someone's job performance might be based on their ability to save lives, right?
Right.
But there's almost none of that.
Huh.
It is really about how many rugs patients created and sold, the baskets that they made. In some cases, the staff were able to take wares that patients had made and win competitions around the country with them.
Right.
But none of the money that the patients were making from all this actually went back to them. It went to offset the cost of their care.
Yeah.
And at points, they are even remarking on renting patients out. Even renting might be a generous term, because again, the money wasn't going to the patients. They are going to private businesses, not unlike the kind of prison labor structure we still have in parts of the country today.
Yeah.
And these patients are doing work for private businesses and then coming back to the asylum at night.
Yeah.
And that is what the sort of institutions, the culture seemed to be prioritizing. The leadership certainly cared to remark on at monthly meetings. That's kind of what they're going through. And I think that tells you a lot about their priorities. And clearly, recovery, rescue, return to home.
Right.
These are not things that they're thinking about in that period.
Right. Or even understanding of what's going on with these people.
Yeah.
Of course, there was a lot less research had been done into psychiatry and trauma and all that and the effects on people, but there seems to have been no effort to better understand what was going on with these people. They just sort of assumed that they were broken. All they could do is labor.
Well, when you think about the fact, and I've talked to a lot of scholars of slavery, the history of slavery in the United States, of the history of psychiatry, and often what they would tell me was, well, if you think about it, at that period, for the vast majority of Black people's existence in this country, the only lens through which they had been understood is what they could produce and do. And so in a way, it almost makes sense. That was the status quo. And that would be all that a doctor had been trained to kind of perceive their patient as.
Right.
And it was part of the reason why what became so important to me was this oral history project.
Yeah.
I realized I can't just depend on the records that are available, that have survived, because they mostly tell you the perspective and the priorities of the people who created and ran the place.
Yeah.
But you will not get the patient perspective or the family perspective, the neighborhood perspective, without actually going out door to door and asking people to talk to me over the course of the last 10 years. And so, I knew as a student that I wouldn't be able to produce an academic work that was honest without that.
Yeah.
And certainly as a journalist, it just became clear to me I wouldn't be able to bring this out into the public and publish it as a book without first really marrying those two elements and figuring out how are they going to complement each other, complicate each other. And so that's part of why this book took so long to finish. Because I had to do that digging. It was harder than the archives.
And you found some amazing people who had been part of this institution their whole lives, worked there, knew the stories, because it sounds as though the archives were very incomplete, and probably with purpose, because a lot of these stories are pretty horrific. And one thing that you point out is how they just sort of threw everybody together. there was no real attempt, or they weren't very good at it in terms of separating people who were dangerous, children. They were just sort of all thrown in together.
Yeah, that's really in those early decades. So from its founding in 1911 up until, halfway through the 50s, maybe arguably up to the 60s even, thinking about how to organize or recognize differences in patients' needs and treatment, really not a priority that's present. The hospital, to kind of bring the listener into what it might be like to step onto Crownsville's grounds in those days. Actually very beautiful from afar, had this kind of bucolic, idyllic country, very expansive green, lush grounds.
That part of the country is beautiful.
It is. And now it's a bit more suburban and built up, and sort of it's adjacent to Annapolis, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that is not what you would have seen. Dirt road after dirt road, cornfield after cornfield, and massive thick forests. And that's where Crownsville is. But if you went behind its brick walls, what you would find was an incredibly filthy. The records and the oral history, one consistent theme is that people who came for the first time were almost hit with a scent that they could never forget, and almost what made them feel like they could never wash it off. You could see feces on the floor, people sleeping two to a bed, head to foot, children next to adults, people suffering with tuberculosis, living on the same wards as people who were not tuberculosis patients. And doctors knew that was, by the way, not the right thing to do, because they had created quarantined wards at all the white hospitals. They just didn't care to do that at Crownsville. And so that's another moment, right, where you can say, actually, we know from what doctors were writing and saying and doing,
they knew better,
that they made a difference. They knew better. This is a place that was really desperate. And there's also a really, really striking power dynamic. All of the staff are white. Not just no Black employees. I mean, no non-white people allowed to work there. And all of the patients are Black. Many of the employees were openly bigoted toward their patients. I mean, using racial slurs, talking about the patients as though they were no better than beasts of the field. And often actually publicly advocating for policies that would harm their patients. And so some of the names on Crownsville buildings or Crownsville roads, they're named after people who were involved in, for example, drafting the first ever apartheid ordinance in the South. And advocating for complete racial separation in Baltimore. But then they were on the board of managers of Crownsville.
Oh my God.
And so, that is still present. I mean, those names are still there. None of that has been, changed or removed. And I actually would never advocate for that.
No, don't.
The history, it hits you over the head. You have to sort of be willfully trying to ignore it. Once you know the names, you kind of can't unsee it all.
And you isolated a lot of stories of children who were picked up for pretty inane, they were having trouble adjusting to one thing or another. And they're thrown into an institution like this and just sort of, get lost in it. It's almost unbelievable.
Absolutely. I think all the time about the story of a patient named John, who comes to the hospital in the 1960s, which is a really fraught period at Crownsville, where still the staff is majority white, but they're trying to integrate. But a lot of the Black staff who just arrived, they are not empowered. They're very young. I mean, some of them as young as 18, 19 years old. They're not able to push back against superiors who've been at the hospital for decades. And so John is a young Black boy who grew up his whole life in Annapolis, down by the water in one of these historic Black neighborhoods in Annapolis. And he comes to Crownsville feeling extremely dejected and depressed. And I sort of through records, but also in getting to know one of his best childhood friend and other people in his community, was able to piece together that he had been really suffering in his family structure and struggling in his relationship with his father and feeling unwanted.
Sounds like his father was a real tough guy, very high standard. His father
was a very high standards. I think it's a story actually a lot of young boys have kind of heard or seen before.
I had a father
where their father has, high standards, kind of obsessed with masculinity. And in some ways they see their son as not able to hack it, to live up to this ideal that they have in their mind. And so John is struggling, and he stops eating. He stops really engaging in any of the activities he likes to do. He pulls away from his friends, and he stops coming to all their hangouts.
Yeah.
And he comes to Crownsville depressed. And to the staff that I have met that knew John, it was very obvious to anyone kind of what was going on there, that, these are kind of typical symptoms of depression.
Yeah.
You stop wanting to do what you love to do. You stop eating. But there was a doctor working on that ward who, whose colleagues describe as, kind of an authoritarian type of figure, not very interested in the lives and personal experiences of patients like John. And he decides that John is self-absorbed, and he tells all the staff, you do not indulge him, don't socialize with him, don't bring him treats and snacks. And when the staff try to do this anyway, the doctor decides, kind of makes a decree that John needs to be hidden behind these opaque screens so that no one makes eye contact with him. And that's kind of his punishment for making everything about him.
Yeah.
John completely gives up on his life and ends up wasting away.
Yeah.
And passing away in the hospital after just 4 months of being there. And this is a boy whose family was only 15 minutes down the road.
Yeah.
And John's story is, it is one patient's life that I was able to recreate, but I tell the story in the book because it was unfortunately really common for young Black children to end up at Crownsville, to not really be seen and heard by the doctors, the leaders in the institution, who in many cases still didn't really care for them or their community.
Mm-hmm.
And he loses his life because of this. And he loses connection to his family. His family's not involved in his care. They're not warned that this is happening.
Yeah.
And I even kind of followed one of John's friends who's changed by this, whose own community, because of kind of these patterns, both at the hospital and in the broader sort of power structure of Baltimore and Annapolis, he ends up suffering himself later in his life. And that's what you see so often in the records, is that there were children, but also adults brought to this institution, many of them with diagnoses that are very treatable, and who, instead of getting the therapy, the support, the connection that they need, are mistreated, are harmed, or sometimes at best just left to their own devices and left to, in a way, just wither away. Yeah. And Crownsville becomes a place that's almost an orphanage at times. Later, as they hire more social workers, those social workers are really trying to act almost like an arm of CPS or the foster care system. They're doing everything they can to try to connect these kids back with kin, to get them placed into schools, into families. But what they find is that often Baltimore-based agencies that are doing this work don't want Black kids. And so these kids are left there. And it was really important to me, even in the decision I made about the cover of this book, in which you can see a young Black boy who's making direct eye contact with the reader. Yeah. And you can see all the white staff standing up above him. They're sort of more physically prominent and clearly in control. Yeah. I think often when people think of asylum stories, they of course think of adults. They think of maybe One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Sure. But in a place like this, children were so much a part of the fabric, so often lost, and their stories weren't recorded properly. Yeah. And so I really felt I had to tell John's, because it's just one example, but it's so telling of just the pain that so many parts of this community endured in connection to what Crownsville was.
As Crownsville Hospital grew from an antebellum-style work camp to a tiny city sitting on 1,500 acres, the institution became a microcosm of America's evolving battles over slavery, racial integration, and civil rights. The hospital always seemed to be understaffed and underfunded, and barely able to care for the basic needs of its patients. At one point in 1945, 10 attendants and 2 physicians managed 1,700 patients. During its peak years after World War II, the hospital's wards overflowed with almost 2,700 patients. Also during that time, the staff slowly started to become racially integrated. In 1949, Crownsville had 1,800 patients and 392 staff members. Just 6 of them were Black. By 1956, Crownsville was home to 2,300 patients and 725 staff members. The number of black staff members had grown to 326. Over and over again with all these stories, you just feel that a lot of these people are just crying out for human connection, for some kind of understanding. And instead, they're sort of treated like dangerous people who should be separated. It's almost like a prison. It's not really a place of any humanity or heart.
Well, one of the sections that I most loved reporting on and just, kind of thumbing through newspaper records and what existed to kind of help me pull that part of the story out was this period in the 50s, really, where the hospital starts to take on, it starts to kind of become this almost mythological thing in the minds of both Black and white Marylanders. For Black Marylanders, it's this terrible place where you go to disappear.
Dangerous place.
Where there are these rumors that start to spread of a night doctor who will scoop you up off the street.
Yeah.
And you'll go to Crownsville and you'll never be seen again. It's almost like a scary story that you'd tell your kid before they went to sleep.
Yeah.
And then in the white community, it becomes this story of these young, Black, wild men in an institution who are a direct threat to the white women living in the neighborhoods surrounding Crownsville. And so in the papers, you can see when there are riots, incidents, escapes from Crownsville, that the language that they use to describe Black men in particular is so highly racialized, sexualized. It constantly kind of implies imminent violence, even when there's no actual violence to report on.
Yeah.
And then when you can compare that to similar incidents at a white institution, I actually think I didn't even include this one in the book, and sometimes I wish I had, which is there was this story about an escape from a pure white institution that's very similar to escapes that had just happened at Crownsville.
Mm-hmm.
And they had described the Crownsville patients as escaping, and people have brought their guns out onto their porches and all that kind of stuff. But this white guy escapes from a nearby white institution. And the papers describe his red fuzzy slippers and the way in which, they kind of describe him as like goofy.
Like folksy.
Yeah. And so you have this image of this silly man running through the woods with slippers on instead of this frightening man who might come into your home and there's an implication of sexual and physical violence, which is what the picture is right down the street. And so technically the same thing has happened. All we know from the information is two types of patients have escaped.
Yeah.
But one gets this kind of forgiving and, kind of goofy story. And the Black community gets something very, very different. And to me, it was so important to show just how powerful language and imagery is, because it then directly impacts policy.
Sure.
So what we see is the neighbors around Crownsville start to advocate for them to build a wall around the institution, get more locks and chains. They don't want to pay for more staff and more therapeutic work, but they want to turn this place into a prison in response to what they've been told is coming out of there.
Yeah.
And I felt like it was so important to kind of bring you outside of the hospital too, to see, well, how does the hospital actually function in this society? How are people imagining this institution? I can tell you and bring you into what it actually looked like and felt like, but sometimes that's not the same thing as what people were believing it was.
Of course.
And I thought that was just as important to take the reader through.
Yeah, well, you get the feeling that it is almost completely separate from the community, that there's very little contact. And you make this point also in the book that the patients are pretty much kept locked in. They don't go outside that much. There aren't that many activities. They start to sort of leak in a little bit, but there's one moment that really struck me when one of the patients is let outside and he goes, "Oh, it's this guy." Like he hasn't seen this guy for weeks or months. I mean, here you are in this beautiful forest and there's all this outdoor space and these people are just kept locked inside. And how the hell is that going to help anybody improve their mental health?
Yeah.
When there are so many opportunities to just interact with nature and, let nature help heal you,
And that patient, that's another patient who I think about all the time. His name was Mr. Bell, and he was discovered by one of the first Black employees in the 50s. who realized he hadn't seen this guy in a long time. So she battles her supervisor to get permission to take the men under her care outside just for a little walk around the yard, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And she looks into his background and she finds out that he's come to Crownsville because her supervisor overheard him speaking downtown in Baltimore with a British accent. And he believed that he must be crazy because he really couldn't imagine that there were Black people with British accents.
Yeah.
So he gets sent to Crownsville, gets stuck there for years. But it turns out after Marie Goff, who's this employee who looks into him, that he had been born in London and he had been a jockey and had come to the U.S. and kind of hit hard times.
Yeah.
But, this idea that he actually had any real recognizable mental illness, she highly doubted. And to her, it was just, it was shocking. She is just barely out of her teens at this point.
Yeah.
And she comes to realize, this job that I had, that this community had fought really long and hard for, the Black community had fought for decades for the opportunity to work at hospitals, to be seen as professional and to come to Crownsville. And she comes in there and Mr. Bell is one of the first cases that makes her realize there are a lot of horrors that have happened here. And I'm now a part of this institution.
Yeah.
And she and a clique of this growing clique of Black employees, they come in and they start trying in their very small ways to subvert some of that, to change and reform it. Mm-hmm. But it's really hard work. And so part of the story, too, it's of course about the patients and what they experience, but it's actually also about this Black community that comes in and they're trying to do what they can every day to save people. But the experience of working there psychologically changes them, too.
Sure.
They face questions all the time, like, can I be a good person and come here?
Yeah.
If I leave, what happens to the people I wanted to serve?
Right.
And there's this constant kind of push and pull and power struggle between, the white staff, the Black staff, and at the bottom of that totem pole, the patients. And that power struggle is at its worst in the 50s and 60s, but it actually is something that really arguably is present even until its closing in 2004.
They don't start hiring African-American staff until after World War II.
Yep.
And one of the first men is Vernon Sparks.
Yep.
I mean, he had an extraordinary background, and even so, it was a struggle. He had to wait until there was a new director who was more sympathetic, and he kind of broke the barrier.
Yeah, I love the story of Vernon Sparks and then the new superintendent, Dr. Jacob Morgenstern.
They sort of go together.
Because there's this moment after the war where you would think the war has changed so much in American society.
Yes.
And you might, in a story like an institutional story like Crownsville, you might imagine that the people who have the guts to bring change, to, kind of stick it to the man, that these are going to be insiders, people with power, who have influence.
Yeah.
But actually the story of Crownsville in that period is that these two outsiders arrive and they're the only two people with the guts to change it.
Yeah.
One is a Jewish man who has just barely escaped the Nazis. He's almost brought to a concentration camp and killed.
Yeah.
He comes to the U.S. with nothing. His family's in poverty for their first few years here. He's able to get a job as a doctor at Crownsville and then rises in the ranks to become the superintendent. And he takes the reins from the guy who had marched those patients into the woods in 1911.
That's right.
So the guy who has loved the plantation structure, this is a guy who Dr. Robert Winter wrote, who loved to have patients serve him meals, not the other way around.
That's right. He had them working in his house.
Yep. Yeah. And then he hands the reins over to this Jewish guy. One of my favorite parts of the story because I spoke to Dr. Morgenstern's daughter, and she tells me that she remembers as a kid that, the previous administration was really obsessed with his family decorating the big house in the Southern sort of antebellum style.
Yeah, it's like a plantation almost.
Exactly. And they're very worried about the aesthetic. They're very worried about what this European Jewish family is about to do. Like, how are they going to decorate this place? and Morgenstern kind of goes along with it. He's like, all right, you can decorate my house. His wife lets them do it.
Right.
But meanwhile, he starts building a relationship with the NAACP and working with volunteers in the community. And he's kind of about to completely change the hospital culture
Yeah.
and kind of pull this antebellum old way of doing things out from under, the previous administration. And so, I have a lot of admiration for Morgenstern and what
absolutely.
he did there. And he is the person who brings Vernon Sparks. He's the person who takes the risk of, I'm going to bring the first Black doctor in here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, you have to eat with him in the dining hall.
Yeah.
And so his first couple of weeks on the job, Vernon is isolated, eating his meals in a back room because, the all white staff are whispering about him and don't really want to interact with him. And then Morgenstern puts an end to that.
Yeah.
And it's these two guys who have been, Vernon Sparks has actually just served in the war.
He's a vet.
They've both been very directly impacted by World War II, by eugenics, by racism.
Right.
And they are the two who decide we're going to do something about this
Right.
place. It's not the old guard who have the guts to change anything.
Yeah, we just fought a war to defeat this, and now we're going to take care of it at home.
Exactly.
Really interesting. And then there's a big change. And as you said, there are these several whole families of men and women, African-American, who come to work at the hospital. It must have been very difficult for them because they're there to help people and they feel much more of a kinship with the patients. And at the same time, they're still part of this sort of oppressive culture that is not really serving the patients and is still picking up people indiscriminately. Parents who had a child who was giving them trouble would just sort of drop them off at the hospital. There was still no real care program. It improved a little bit, but still it's a very incomplete process and unsatisfactory, and they're not releasing people. You're just locked away.
Yeah, and it really is something that takes an emotional toll on the employees, and they start to try to protect themselves and support each other by, one family, the Belt family. And Gertrude Belt, the mom, she's one of the first Black employees. Her daughter, Faye, is raised on the grounds and later becomes a nurse there herself. They have a house that's right on the edge of the property. Mm-hmm. So the Black staff start all kind of using that house as a gathering place. They take naps there in between their sort of double shifts. Mm-hmm. They eat there. They invite patients to come and have play dates with their kids. They are playing baseball out in the fields on that corner of the property. And they start to just try to enrich their own lives, but also the lives of the patients.
Yeah.
And they do this without funding, without the support, without like a real, blessing from the administration. They just kind of build all this for themselves to make the job survivable because they're seeing all that you just described, because they are. And I think the other thing that's important for people to know is this is not surface level diversity. This is not just, suddenly some people who have the same skin tone are working there with people who kind of look like them.
Right.
They actually, in many cases, know these patients. I tell the story when Faye Belt becomes a nurse. One of her first and sort of toughest assignments becomes getting the phone call that one of her childhood friends is a patient.
Yeah.
And so she has to add on to her own shifts every day to go to the march to the other side of the hospital and take this friend out on walks and really help and support her so that she can make a recovery.
Yeah.
And, and I heard from so many families that were working there while their own first cousin was there, their former classmate, someone they rode the bus to school with, was institutionalized and in their care.
Yeah.
And so in a way, this is both a tragic and painful thing, but it's also, I think, a story about a real, what becomes for a period of time, a real community hospital.
Yeah.
There is nowhere in the country, I don't think for anyone, but certainly I think for Black patients, where you could go and know that your nurse knows your mom.
Yeah.
Your doctor knows where you went to church.
Yeah.
They know your school teacher.
Yeah.
And they can pick up the phone and update them on your care. And that's what starts happening there, because that's really the only tool this community had. They weren't in leadership yet. They're not the supervisors. They don't get to set policy. They're not ordering the drugs. They aren't even honestly deciding a lot of times, well, what's the final diagnosis here?
Yeah.
They can only kind of use those communal tools and interpersonal relationships to impact patient outcomes. And they do have a real effect on the outcome.
It almost becomes an example of the kind of community care that is later championed.
Absolutely. And that many of them now think is completely missing from our mental health care system.
Crownsville wasn't unique. In 1969, the Central State Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane opened in Petersburg, Virginia, becoming the first psychiatric facility in the U.S. to exclusively treat African American patients. The conditions at Central State when it opened were akin to warehouses, quote, not necessarily for health reasons, but for reasons of control, of punishment, said Professor Sean Utze, who made a documentary about the facility called the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane. Some of what Dr. Utze learned from making the documentary surprised him. Quote, I was expected to learn of this tremendously awful institution that was a horror story for Black people in the antebellum South in the wake of the Civil War, and that it continued to misdiagnose and otherwise harm the Black community. But that's not all that I found, he said. What jumped out at me were the stories of the former employees who transformed the lives of patients because of their own caring and their own focus on the humanity of the patients. It didn't turn out that way, but that was the objective. So let's talk about that for a minute, because in 1963, President Kennedy, he has a personal interest in mental health issues because of his sister. He passes the Community Mental Health Act, which sort of fosters this whole idea of community support. It's a really noble idea, and certainly the experience at Crownsville bears that out, how effective it can be.
And actually down at the local level, there are state lawmakers and county leaders who are echoing what JFK is saying, and they're claiming they're about to do what he's asked them to do, which is this federal-state partnership. You know, the federal government is almost going to act like an incubator, an accelerator that's going to provide upfront funding for mental health services. You're going to build all these local community centers, clinics. You're going to have people specializing in these different types of care. You're going to help patients get home so they can live with their family. And we'll upfront some of the costs. But then there's a cost sharing element. So the state needs to start kind of taking over the responsibility and leading its own way. That's all good and fine.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening at the state level is that state lawmakers over the years, kind of their interest, their commitment to it kind of falters. They don't want to quite put up all the money that it requires. And so, you know, this announcement comes in the 60s. But by the mid-70s, the state of Maryland has only built one of these clinics, and in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And I mean, Baltimore, the kind of heart and bustling and most boisterous part of the state, has only one clinic to serve people after really a decade of opportunity to get some of this work done.
Yeah.
And so it's not just, it's not this simple story. Often people tell the story, okay, JFK has this idea, then Nixon and Reagan come and they knock it off the table and it all falls apart.
Right.
The truth is it's a lot more complicated than that, because the states kind of failed to do their end of the bargain. The federal government, in some cases, didn't give everything they needed to provide.
Yeah.
They weren't always tracking and pushing and kind of committing to a timeline to actually get the work done. And every year in which you don't get this work done, patients are slipping through the cracks.
Right.
And the state hospitals that you are now underfunding because you're trying to build these other places, they're still full of patients and still struggling to get it done. And so this mess ensues where they're undoing the old way, the asylum structure.
Right.
But they haven't actually figured out what's replacing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you know, it's easy to say one guy ruined it all, Reagan ruined it all, but that's actually too simple.
Yeah.
And, you know, people all the way down from the president's office to, county executives and mayors are at fault here. Mm-hmm. And, you know, at the same time, then, one of the things I look closely at in the book is, you know, the civil rights movement is getting going. The Black Power movement is very much out in the open. Mm-hmm. And there is this carceral reaction to all of that. So there's a lot of people getting arrested and brutalized in the streets. And the Black communities are starting to raise concerns about, you know, just their relationships to police departments, to authority. Yeah. And we're starting to see more investment year after year in jails and prisons at the same moment that were pulling back from the asylum.
Yeah.
And so in a way, the community mental health thing never materializes, but another institution does very much materialize.
Yes.
And, you know, when I talked to the experts and when I talked to people at Crownsville who watched what happened to their own patients, they saw them leave Crownsville and come up against a couple options. One was to be homeless, to be struggling very openly out in the street.
Yeah.
Their patients would call them and say, I can't get into the clinic. I can't get appointments. This just isn't happening for me.
Yeah.
The other is that they were arrested, charged with various crimes related to poverty and to addiction, and they ended up in jails and prisons.
Yeah.
And then the other is that they died. Several Crownsville patients, I was able to track through the people who had been working with them, died from hypothermia. Just out on the street. They were living under bridges and overpasses.
Yeah.
They, they had nothing. And the staff would drive through the cities in which they lived and see their own former patients out on the road. And, the Belt family to this day, one of the things that they do when they have free time is they pack up socks and snacks and COVID masks and all kinds of stuff. And they just drop it off because they know where some of their former patients still are. To this day, the hospital closed in 2004.
Yeah.
It's now 2024, and they are
still doing it.
They are still trying to keep track of where the people they used to work with are.
Yeah, you talk about there's sort of the juxtaposition of a couple things that happened starting in the late 50s into the 60s and 70s. And that is the idea of community centers, the civil rights movement, the explosion of prisons all over the country. I think you said in 1990 there was like one prison opened every week in the United States. I mean, that's just incredible. And then there's the introduction of, I guess you would call them more scientific methods of treatment, which include shock treatment and drugs that just kind of zap people out. And I've had that experience in my family with a relative, and, he was just gone. I mean, they just kept him on Thorazine all the time, and he didn't even recognize people after a while.
Yeah, well, these drugs arrive from Europe, and they're seen as wonder drugs at first. There's a lot of excitement, almost a belief that they're like a silver bullet.
Yeah.
And doctors are amazed at the extent to which they change patient behavior and seem to calm patients down. There is a lot to be thankful for with these drugs, by the way. I am not someone who's advancing an anti-drug argument in the book, but certainly what I, show and in my conversations with the people who are actually doling these things out on the wards was that they really weren't the silver bullet that so many had hoped that they were. And while, yes, they kind of stupefied and quieted the wards.
Right, pacify them.
They weren't always leading to recovery. And then the other complication with medication is, well, once you send someone back out into the community, getting them to stay on medication, to commit to care, is a challenge on, just on an individual level for someone who's struggling in that way to remember to take a medication at a certain time or to remember appointments that they may have. But the other piece is because we had failed to build the community mental health, structure. There aren't really the clinics that are supposed to check in on these patients. So there aren't doctors going to their homes and asking them all the questions they were supposed to ask.
Right.
There aren't people refilling their prescriptions. And without that, what you have are a population of people who are going to very publicly struggle and then be at risk for interactions with the other parts of the carceral system. And I write at one point about a doctor named Dr. Brian Sims, whose whole job as a psychiatrist at one point was to really emphasize this community drive. He was getting in his own Dodge and driving to neighborhoods in Maryland and meeting with his patients and trying to help them.
Yeah.
And many of them were on this sort of court-appointed probationary period where they are supposed to be monitored and supported, and they need to commit for about a 5-year period to staying on medication, to going to certain appointments, the same way when you hear about somebody out on parole. They can't miss meetings with their parole officer.
Yeah, and they were very strict about that.
Exactly. But when someone's suffering with a mental illness, asking them to commit to a perfect regimen, a perfect schedule for 5 years, I actually don't think most people could just promise to make every appointment they had over a course of 5 years. And so they fail.
Yeah.
And that recidivism put them at risk of coming back to Crownsville or worse,
Yeah.
getting sent to prisons and jails in Maryland.
Yeah.
And so a lot of former Crownsville patients are to this day in some of the prisons in Maryland. Some of them are going to spend the rest of their lives there. And it's something that really has broken the hearts of so many of the staff members who worked with them.
I'm sure.
And who had spent hours trying to get them back home to help them figure this out, because they feel like at the exact moment where they were just starting to make improvements with these patients, building trusting relationships, getting them on a regimen, that then the funding and the support and the backing from both the administration at the hospital level, but also the governor's office in Maryland, it disappeared.
Yeah.
And there was just, it seemed to them, this kind of decision, well, we're gonna kind of accept the chaos that comes with this.
Yeah.
And taking care of people in places like Crownsville, or in clinics just isn't our priority now.
The ending of the book is sort of an incomplete ending, not in terms of the book, but in terms of just the story, because, you come away feeling very strongly like we still haven't solved this problem. And closing down places like Crownsville was not the answer. And there is no answer. There hasn't been an answer. And we see evidence of that in all parts of our country. How do you feel having done all this research and then watching the closing of Crownsville and, a lot of dedicated people, doctors and people, staff that work there, just sort of like, as you say, making sandwiches and going out on their own and trying to help people. But clearly they still feel a need that, it's not resolved in their minds either.
It's absolutely not resolved. I think that what's up for debate is what we should do about it.
Yeah.
But I really don't think that what's up for debate is our mental health system functioning well.
Right. Yeah.
It's not.
It
is not. And I write about this from a personal perspective. I write a couple essays in the book about what's happened. I tell the story of my father's cousin Maynard, but also a family member of mine who is very actively struggling to get connected to good care in this moment.
Yeah.
And my family has good insurance.
Yeah.
And I travel as a reporter for NBC. I talk to people, wealthy people, poor people, Black people, white people.
Yeah.
I talk to people. Nobody is happy with the system.
No.
And, people of all political backgrounds have a touch point for the system.
I talk to a lot of veterans, and it's a disaster among veterans. I mean, the suicide rate is astronomical.
It is. And talk to teachers coming out of COVID, what they're seeing among children right now. They're trying to ring the alarm. They're trying to get people to care about this.
Yeah.
And they're struggling. And I think that we're in this really weird and interesting moment where everyone talks about self-care and therapy, and they're trying to destigmatize these issues. And people aren't embarrassed anymore to say I have a therapist.
Right.
But at the same time, we're not really seeing our elected officials and leaders come up with a plan. They're not really coming forward with legislation.
Right.
There seems to be kind of this hands in the air. Okay, well, we just have to accept we're going to have lots of Americans who have nowhere to live, and they are very much struggling out in all of our cities and communities. I guess we're just going to have to accept how many people get shot in public
right.
schools and community spaces all around the country.
Yeah.
And when I talk to these doctors, certainly, I've spoke to people both who were at Crownsville for quite a long time, and then other physicians around the country who just are familiar with the system. In their view, the solution to all this is not really rocket science.
No.
And we don't have to just give up and accept things the way they are. There are a lot of lessons we can learn from our attempt at building the community mental health system that we just didn't fund.
Yeah.
And from what these hospitals were doing well, what they were doing right in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
There were laboratories to a certain extent of, what
Yeah.
works and what doesn't work. So people have learned a lot from these very difficult experiences. But, it's another one of those things in our society. It's not an area that makes money, And so it's hard to get people motivated when so much of our system revolves around making money and producing things that people think add value.
Yeah.
And people who need help, who can't function in the society for one reason or another, all kinds of, traumas that happen to people, accidents, illnesses and so on, they're just sort of left by the side. And if they have relatives who care, the relatives have to sort it out without a lot of help. And if they don't have people who care for them, then they end up on the street.
Yeah, I think the other piece of it too, in addition to money always mattering, is I think that while there have been improvements in the shame and the stigma wrapped around all of this, that there is still, that it still is a major function here.
I think there's people have a lot of fear.
They have a lot of fear.
It could happen to me. I don't want to be like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And I can relate to that. I mean,
Sure.
in my own family, there is a fear of, given what we've seen happen to some family members, what's going to happen to me?
Right.
What might I pass on to my children? That's something that me and my siblings talk about. And so there is a hurt and a kind of silent pain that comes with that.
Yeah.
And I think that, what that means is that in order to get something like another Community Mental Health Act kind of brought to the fore, you would need there to be a constituency, a group of people who want to talk publicly about these things, who are coming forward.
Yeah.
And in the 40s and 50s, we had a bit of that because there were so many people who actually were connected to people in asylums because they were so big and they were so prevalent.
Yeah.
And there had been all these shameful investigations of just how terribly they had operated. So there was anger, public anger about it.
Yeah.
But right now, it seems like so much of the mental health care system has become this individualized thing.
Yeah.
Where you're either kind of quietly suffering on your own, or you're quietly doing the work on your own, and you're being told that the solution is, a meditation app,
right,
and you going to bed earlier and put your phone away. And yes, those things help.
Sure.
But the truth is that, like, a lot of what you see in terms of the mental health crisis and rising rates of these different challenges among certainly kids right now is that it is a communal issue.
Yeah.
So we are not going to solve it by asking kids to meditate on their phones at night. We are going to have to solve it by coming together and realizing all of us are struggling and deciding that we are going to force our electeds to do something about it.
Yeah.
But I think we're missing that. It's like the conversation is kind of bubbling on the surface, but we're missing that piece of it. And I don't think it's impossible to get there.
I don't think so either.
But we have to listen more to the people who know how to get it done.
The realization has to dawn stronger and deeper. We are a community, and that this does affect us. And we're just a step or an accident or a disease away from being in the same situation.
Yep.
It is acute. I mean, I've just in my own family seen the effect that the isolation of COVID has had on children.
Yep.
And they're still coping with that. It's not over because they spent 2 years of their lives apart from their schoolmates and, with not a lot to do and not a lot of support. And so, we are so interconnected in so many ways, and we still it hasn't struck home for some reason. I don't know how bad it has to get, but it's really bad. When
I talk to people, I really think there is actually a consensus on this.
Yeah.
There's just not a public recognition of that consensus.
Yeah.
And I agree, how bad is it going to have to get?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think that it can get worse. It can get worse.
It's getting worse. I mean, you see it in the growth of the homeless community.
Yeah.
Growing like crazy every year. I live in Los Angeles, and, it's everywhere. Beautiful communities, nicest homes, and so on. And you turn the corner, and there's people living under a bridge.
Yeah. People have to come to, as you said, that recognition that you're not actually so different from the people under the bridge.
Yeah.
And that most of us are one life crisis away.
That's right.
From, studies show the vast majority of Americans don't have enough money saved to actually respond to massive financial and mental health crises. Mm-hmm. Just in my family alone, taking care of one family member cost us tens of thousands of dollars in the course of just about 2 years.
Yeah.
I come from a big family. We were able to do it. Most Americans wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah.
And we know that. And we count ourselves as lucky, even though we were traumatized by that experience.
Yeah, sure.
And so I think some of this is also just about not seeing us ourselves as so separate from so many people who are struggling.
Yeah.
As journalists, like we both know people who have gone overseas and covered stories and come back and not been the same. You are really one life experience away from needing care. And you might like to think you're never going to be that person, but I think eventually these things bear down on all of us, directly or through our families. And so I guess we've decided we're going to sink lower until we're going to do something about it.
Yeah, it seems that way.
But the part that I try to tell my readers is, as much as there's heartbreak in this book and there's the pain and the recognition that we've kind of stooped low, there are amazing people these healthcare workers who, when we are ready to listen, will show us a way. They will try to help. They will volunteer their time.
That's right.
Because they're already actually doing it on a small scale. They just need a little bit more.
We know the answer. The answer is in your book. One of the nurses said, all they need is care. They need love and care. And once they have that, they start to trust. They come out of their shell. They're better. They need to get outside, a little exercise. All those elements are in this book, in this story. And that's the hopeful part. So we do know the road to recovery. It's right there for us. You know, we have to find the will to take it as a society.
I hope we do. Thank you so much.
One of the stories Antonia tells in her book is about the Elkton Three civil rights activists named Wallace Nelson, Juanita Nelson, and Rose Robinson, who were arrested in 1961 for trying to sit down and eat at Bar H. Chuck House near Elkton, Maryland. The owner denied them service because they were black. Refusing to leave, they were charged with trespassing and arrested by local police. Because the three started a hunger strike in jail, they were sent to Crownsville. Antonia writes of this incident, quote, "Crownsville had become a weapon against those who dared oppose the existing order. It's another part of the racial shame that was institutionalized in Crownsville." But her book is about more than racial shame or the legacy of slavery. It's also about us deciding as individuals and as a society who is worthy of our care. It's about asking ourselves, are we finally going to deal with the crises of mental illness, housing insecurity, and income disparity that are bearing down on all of us? Are we open to listening to solutions? Or are we going to continue burying our heads deeper and deeper into the sand? I thank Antonia for her deeply compassionate and important book and recommend it highly. It's my great honor to name Antonia Hylton as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzullo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Music provided by Extreme Music. For exclusive content, please join our Patreon group at patreon.com/heroesbehindheadlines.